Welcome, Baltic World. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
This is our week in review. Baltic World is a channel where we discuss important issues facing Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe. But before we begin, where are we, Crispin?
We are both in the same location, in the same part of the world.
It has been too long.
This is actually the first time that Charlene has seen this place with her own eyes.
Mm-hmm.
What were the first impressions?
It's pretty impressive. I've seen the videos you sent me and the photos, and I didn't think it was okay, but actually being in the studio, it's way better than I could have ever imagined. The painting is great, the soundproofing is great. Yeah, it's kind of, surreal to be actually here, given how many months it's actually been.
Yeah, so the one thing that is still a bit up in the air is how we're going to make the background and everything right, because we had to make sure all the background facilities were all working properly, with the sort of backdrop being an afterthought. But we will get to that point eventually. Now that Charlene's here, I'm sure that will accelerate. Yeah. But more importantly, it means that content will also accelerate. Why is that, Charlene?
Because I'm taking a break. For those who don't know, I have another job, like many people in the world. And now I'm actually taking 12-month leave in order to concentrate on this channel and a couple of other projects we're working on. And so you're just going to see content pumping out left, right, and center. So, yes.
Really looking forward to it for you guys. Okay, but our first video for 2023 had a bit of an interesting response. It's funny, when you put on a video for YouTube, there's a questionnaire you have to fill out about, how much violence is there, how, the firearms and things, is there lots of swearing? But there's a question that says, how controversial is this video? And I put none. So I might have gotten a bit of trouble with YouTube with that video. No, I haven't, but I could. Yeah. Because the response was quite divergent. And I didn't realize that people would have such strong feelings about it, which I'm sure we will get into. But it was just one of those things that was really surprising that, I could understand plenty of people disagreeing, being like, it's not appropriate because the EU is already there, or, that it's not really necessarily a high priority. Yeah. But for people to be like, oh no, or definitely yes, was a bit surprising. So I'm actually grateful for the response, but it got me thinking about what some of those issues were. Exactly.
I've never been so much ratioed in my life, Crispin, because we thought, this is such a good topic to talk about. Let's share it on Reddit. And I got so ratioed, and I will share those comments in the video. So there were definitely some concerns. So when you published the video...
Well, first of all, what was the video?
What was the video? So the video we're talking about is basically welcoming back the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth in 2023, given with the Ukraine war and how politically aligned Poland, Lithuania, and the rest of the Baltic countries are currently in terms of the threat of Russia. And again, yes, there were some controversial statements made.
Yeah, so for everyone who doesn't know, which will be some of you, the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth was among the most successful political unions in world history. It lasted around 250 years, where first of all, this had already been in the case, but the King of Poland was also the Grand Duke of Lithuania, and previously they'd been separate. But then they joined in a kind of political union, the Treaty of Lublin, and until the late 1700s, it was essentially a confederation, a united empire, not unlike the United Kingdom with England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, at the height of its power, included much of modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia. And given how unified these countries are in terms of their foreign policy, not just against Russia, but also Germany, France, who have very different ideas about the way the war in Ukraine should go, to be a kind of stalwart against potentially future aggression. Again, with the rise of China and the fact that the United States, which has been an omnipresent, all-overwhelming power in Europe since the end of the Second World War, will no longer be the case when it's forced to focus on the maritime theatre that is the Pacific Ocean. So given that there needs to be a counterweight to not only Russia, but the kind of lackluster weakness that we've seen in some of the Western European countries, excluding Britain, which I think has been very positive and forceful, the reconstitution of the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth would be a strong political entity capable of doing that.
Yeah.
But people had different views, which we'll discuss.
Yeah. They very much do. Okay, so I kind of separated the arguments in several different camps. The main concerns, which is called the no camp, is I want to give a shout out firstly to Paulius Pazagius, yes, who summarized the reasons quite well in this no camp. Population size and representation in the Union. Even though it was called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a lot of people recognize it as the Polish Commonwealth and drop Lithuania altogether. And given that Poland is basically 5 times the size of Lithuania, how would it work?
Okay, well, first of all, the European Parliament is done on population size as well. I mean, you could make the same argument for being a member of the EU, that why would you make membership of the EU a priority when the largest players, France, Germany, have massive population size and can dominate the parliament as a bloc? The Baltic countries have made the calculus that being a member of the EU is beneficial, outweighs the costs. And I think that the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, which, by the way, would include the other Baltic countries, a free Belarus and Ukraine, the fact that the population distribution is somewhat skewed, it does not in and of itself mean that each individual player will be overwhelmed by that any more than that's been the case with the EU. It depends on how you set that up, and making sure that each of the smaller countries have an equal say in things that affect everybody. And I think of the Australian system, actually political system, we have a bicameral system, much like the United States, where we have a very strong House of Representatives and a Senate that is very strong. Now, the Senate makes sure that all of the states have equal representation regardless of the state size. So we've got Tasmania with only 500,000 people. It has the same number of senators as New South Wales, which has many millions, right? It's just a matter of how you structure it. So you might have a similar system here, a bicameral kind of representative body where perhaps you would have a number of seats based upon location, which would overall mean that you'd have more from Poland or from Ukraine, and fewer from the Baltic countries. But then you make sure you counterbalance that to make sure that no, you can't run roughshod over the interests of the smaller players. It just requires foresight. One of the major concerns will be, how do we protect the smaller players? We make sure that we find a way to do that. Rotate the presidency like you do with the EU. Make sure that each of the countries gets to set the executive agenda. There are ways of doing that without overrunning the small players. Now, again, Poland is bigger than the Baltic countries, but Ukraine is bigger than Poland. You have 40 million people in Ukraine. And there's 10 million people in Belarus. So there is, even though there's bigger players, no one player is going to be able to dominate the rest. No one is actually that big that on their own they can control things. So although I'm saying restore the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, I really mean the entire Baltic, the Ukrainians, a free Belarus post-Lukashenko, and of course Poland.
Okay, so drawing back, so the safeguards that we could have put in place just to make sure the Baltic countries still have a say in the Commonwealth.
Absolutely, they should have a veto. They should be able to make sure that nothing happens that affects everybody without their involvement. Just as that would be true for any one of the constituent players. Well, the point of the Commonwealth is to be able to have a shared common foreign and security policy. So you'd have perhaps a ceremonial president. So you're saying that this is a political entity. Okay. And we're going to share some of our military forces, and we're going to make sure everything's interoperable, that all of the rail sort of gradings are the same, and all of the ammunition that we use is the same, and we'll be able to do collective bargaining when we go over to the United States and buy lots of tanks and things. We can do it as a group, and we all agree what our battle plans are and our intelligence services are, and you combine commonality of that while maintaining separate political entities for your domestic policy. So you don't have a Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth official language. You don't have a Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth policy on education or healthcare. It's purely in the political, foreign policy, security realm. And each individual country maintains their own political system in that process.
Okay, right. I think many people who watched our video actually took the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth video as face value, that this is literally just a union between Lithuania and Poland. And many Lithuanians do not even like the idea. I got so ratioed on Reddit because of this. I'm just going to read some comments out.
By all means.
I completely and undoubtedly do not support this. Yes, and after we can join the Roman Empire, and after we can join the Martian Federation of United Lunatics. No, the Poles themselves call it exclusively the Polish Empire. Joining it is the same as joining the Soviet Union, perhaps a little closer to the European Union.
Okay, if we pause there, one of the things that I really regret about the memory of the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, particularly as it's remembered in Lithuania, is this concept called, quote-unquote, Polonization. The idea that, yes, there was a union, but the Poles just took over everything, and that in the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, Poland called the shots, and Lithuania was relegated to second-class citizens in their own country, and so forth. This is what I'm about to say is controversial, and people are going to potentially ratio us again. I don't think that is true. I think what happened was there was an exceptionally lazy period of historiography, where historians, they get the documentation from the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth and they go, it's all in Polish. Therefore, it must have been the Poles taking over. Add to that a kind of linguistic laziness where people talk about the King of Poland, Lithuania. Well, that's a mouthful, so people just shorthanded it to the King of Poland. So when you've got on the one hand people talking about the King of Poland dropping off the Lithuania bit, and much of the historical documents being in Polish, people say, well, clearly Poland took over everything. I don't think that reflects an accurate appraisal of the history. First of all, there were things that were totally separate between Lithuania and Poland, even in the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. They had two different legal codes, two different armies, two different treasuries. The number of szlachters in the body, now that's a Polish word, was disproportionately Lithuanian because you had to be a noble in order to be a member. And yet, unlike Poland, 1/10 of the population of Lithuania was a noble, magnate. That was vastly higher ratio than just about anywhere else in Europe. And so there were many more Lithuanians with influence within the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth than is commonly recognized. Now, Polish was the language of government. So when people look at the documents, they go, oh, it's all in Polish, therefore Poland took over. That is not the case. The Poles had their own grievances as well within the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. For example, Lithuania was constantly invaded, first from Sweden, but also Russia. And it was Polish taxes, Polish money that funded the defense of the realm, because that's all the taxes went to, 80% for some 30 years or so. And the Poles were like, well, why are we spending all this money just to defend Lithuania, when in fact the king, quite rightly, was like, this is all one realm, you're defending your homeland, even though they're a different part of the realm. And one could say with certainty that without the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, Lithuania would have very likely not existed as a consequence of that union. So, and equally, there were times when Poland did take advantage of the fact that Lithuania was a party to it, and there was a particular time when the Lithuanian magnates were quite upset with the king, and the king punished Lithuania by moving a lot of territory from what was Lithuania into Poland. So there were issues along the way, but one can always point to the negative. I mean, on the flip side of all this, both countries maintained their identity, their laws, their structures. The king had to make two oaths, one as the King of Poland and as the Grand Duke. The armies could not move through each other's territories without permission. So it wasn't a takeover. And while, yes, Lithuanian leaders, magnates did find it beneficial to learn Polish and to make sure they understood the court in Krakow, equally, they maintained their independence by virtue of the fact that many tried to defect. There was a plot in the 1500s where a group of magnates from Lithuania got together and tried to move Lithuania from the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth into the Kingdom of Sweden. So all throughout, there were these separate things. There was no doubt that they were separate. But all these examples I'm giving you of how they were separate are overshadowing the bits where they were voluntarily united, where they saw things eye to eye, had a similar outlook, similar religion, similar perspective on the world. And also the 30 Years' War, right, which some would say is even worse than the First World War that ended in the Treaty of Westphalia. For the first time, you had a major power saying, actually, you can have multiple religions within the state, and that's fine. We can practice religious tolerance. People can believe how they see fit. We're not a Catholic monarchy or a Protestant monarchy. We're just the monarchy of the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. And as a consequence, relative to the other powers, the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth was the least devastated as a consequence of that conflict. So they didn't have massive uprisings within their own populace who were all contented because they could all practice their religion the way they see fit. The whole 30 Years' War was an exercise in the rest of Europe catching up to the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, where they go, actual national identity and religion can be separate things. And again, evidence of that, in Belarus, you had Ruthenians, predominantly Orthodox as it is today. Even in the wars against Muscovy, the Orthodox Belarusians were loyal to the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. That shows how successful it is. And if you can't just look at the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth as a relationship between Lithuania and Poland, but comparing the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth to the other political entities in Europe, and it was vastly more successful. So people make these kind of things, Poland taking over everything. That's not the fault of the people saying it because they learn this in school and so on, but it's purely, I think, laziness on the part of the historians who just look at, it's in Polish, therefore Poland took over everything. Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth is a long thing to say, so we'll just say King of Poland. This is not reflective of what actually happened, in my opinion.
Yeah. It was successful in some ways, but a lot of people in the comment section have asked us, that's really convenient for you to say all these positive things about the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, but it fell apart eventually. Was it at the fault of the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, or was it because Lithuania just kept getting invaded?
Well, that's it. It fell apart for the very reason it's now necessary.
Right.
It fell apart because it ultimately got carved up between other powers, between Sweden, between Russia, between Germany, or pre-German states. If we think about the wars in the area that crisscrossed that region, so two invasions of Russia, Napoleon, the King of Sweden, went across all of that territory. You had also the Soviets coming back across that territory when marching towards Berlin. It's a very difficult area to defend. And as we're seeing right now in Ukraine, it has always been tempting for the great powers on the periphery to try and take bits of it. If you have a strong, united political entity in that part of the world capable of defending its own borders, then you put a stop to all of those things. And as we can see from Germany, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, these other players in Western Europe can't be relied upon. This is something that is self-reliant. Now, the only country in Europe that I think has done enough is the British, who are clearly committed to preserving Western liberal traditions in Europe. And they have to step up because, as I said before, the United States will be distracted elsewhere. There are some other great countries as well, the Czech Republic and so forth, but they're, again, all Central Europe.
Okay. I guess, and the last main concern came out from the comments is why are we going to enter into something and fix something that isn't technically broken? So you think about it, entering an arrangement with Poland and the other countries could threaten Lithuania's identity. And the political systems are different. Eventually, there'll be a shift in priorities after the Ukraine war. Like, how would you manage that?
Okay, so again, the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth wasn't a fly-by-night. It existed for 250 years in an environment in some of the greatest upheaval in European history, where things just disappeared overnight. That was a fixture. So it's been proven to work, first of all. Secondly, one of the criticisms I hear, which is sort of similar to that, is that we already have the EU. We've already got a supranational entity that includes many of the European players. And I would say that the European Union has never functioned as well as when it was first established as a kind of European community of economic integration. And primarily the Western European countries at a time when the Soviet Union was still around and we still had the Iron Curtain. As it is extended to include basically anybody who shows an interest in joining, it has lost its core element. Particularly, it will never achieve a security dimension. Like NATO will always have that role. And that's because the interests of all the different players are so desperate. I mean, obviously the Brits have already left. I think it's an open question whether we'll see other major economies depart the European Union. We of course had the Greek debt crisis, and the fissures that brought between southern and northern Europe. I don't think that the European Union is this utopia that everyone cracks it up to be. What I can say is that the Central European powers that have been the strongest defending Ukraine's sovereignty and have the greatest claim to historical kinship with these surrounding countries. So after all, the Belarusian government in exile is currently in Vilnius. They do have a similar outlook. Very hard to say that they have the same outlook as France or Spain. And therefore, you're not really duplicating, you're solidifying something that I think already exists. And a Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth would give that a much greater say within the European Union. I mean, again, it's all done on population. It would accelerate Ukraine's admission into the EU because it would be part of the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. And the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, when acting as a bloc on economic and security issues within the European Commission, would have a much greater political sway. So I don't actually see any downside other than managing the anxiety through practical responses of dealing with concerns about Poland or any other player dominating the actual Commonwealth. Because we can deal with that with a strong constitution. You can deal with that with strong rights of the constituent members. And yes, while I do share concerns about being overgoverned, being a member of the EU, NATO, all these other bodies, I think in this particular case, it's reconstituting something that was always proven to be a success. And I think the negative memory that people have of it is a false memory. I don't think that's what was happening at the time. Yeah, none of this is to say that I think it's going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
Well,
but
hang on,
there's
no.
camp.
I would not go that far. I would say it's unlikely. And what I would say is that if it was put on the agenda and people had an opportunity to debate it in a positive way, you say, look, they go, we don't want, like the reflexive response, as has been in the comments, we don't want to be in a Commonwealth where Poland's just reconstituting its empire and so on, and we're just slaves to that. So, okay, how do we craft a Commonwealth where that is unlikely to happen? Okay, you start talking about the solutions, because I think the upsides do start to creep in after not very long, actually. And so while I don't think it's going to happen, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's not. It's a matter of getting it on the agenda and having honest people who are good faith actors getting together and debating it.
I think a lot of people, there seems to be a consensus where they don't want to use the name Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth because of the negative connotations of history that people have been taught. But they do agree that having a united arrangement with having basically the attitude that let's be allies and work closer together for and align our political and economic priorities, that they support, especially in the military front. There are other ideas been raised by some of our commenters about 3Cs initiative that it contains 12 countries from the EU that already kind of walk this line about having economic and geopolitical interests. So perhaps that's the way to go rather than label it Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. What's the advantage? Why did you put it out there besides clickbait?
Okay, well, we said a lot there. So the second part of that video was promoting a new formal treaty between the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, Poland, a free kind of Ukraine, and Great Britain. And that was because if you look at NATO as a whole, the US is going to be focused on China and therefore will not be able to invest properly in European security. The French and the Germans no longer fear an invasion from Russia. That underpins a lot of issues we're dealing with right now. But they do see kind of NATO as valuable in promoting quote unquote security elsewhere. So the wars in Syria, Afghanistan, and so forth. Whereas the Baltic countries and now Sweden and Finland, they joined NATO not because of any of that, but purely because of a recalcitrant, resurgent Russia. That should be formalized as a treaty. Say, okay, Russia, you might think that if China invades Taiwan, America's distraction will be such that you can try this again with the Germans and the French not really caring. What needs to happen is to have a formal treaty with those that are willing, and Britain probably being the linchpin major power of that, saying, okay, if you invade any of what was NATO territory, this alliance is going to take over. The problem with NATO is that it's trying to make something permanent that is never supposed to be permanent. An alliance has to respond to changing interests and power dynamics. Alliance is simply a policy, okay? And when the Cold War ended, NATO cast about for something to do and currently has been reinvigorated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But even then, we can see the divergent interest between the players.
Yeah, of course.
And again, with the rise of China, that's going to fall by the wayside. So we need to get ahead of that with a new security policy. And I think, yes, it is possible to do that separate to a Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, which I think is what the audience members have adroitly picked up on and understand, and make that distinction. So that's fine. Why do I think the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth is still important? Is because it takes away Russia's sphere, quote unquote. Right? Russia thinks that it has a sphere of influence, that it controls the Slavic populations, and that that's just raison d'etre, right? That there's a pan-Slavic nation of Bulgarians and Serbs and, of course, Ukrainians, even Poles, who all belong to the inheritors of the Byzantine tradition from their perspective under Moscow. What a Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth does is puts paid to that. It says, look, no, there's a major power in Central Europe that all of these players have voluntarily decided that it would be a part of, and it includes Catholic Slavs, Orthodox Slavs, Balts, Ruthenians, like all these different type groups who reconstitute something that had already been there a long time. Like, this is not the comment about, oh yes, we can reconstitute the Roman Empire. So that the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth is something that existed in relatively modern history in the context of the way these things are. Okay, I don't actually see it as that difficult. Now, you might modify the name, because you've got new political entities in there. You might call it something wholly new, but I would like to see it modelled on the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. The first sort of political entity in Europe that was pseudo-democratic in the sense that it had an assembly of nobles. So obviously not universal suffrage the way you and I would know it, but by the standards of the day, definitely. It has, a common sense of, tolerance of various religious groups within this umbrella. And I think I don't have the negative connotations about the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. I actually lament its loss. It would be wonderful if it was still around today. And I think today, reconstituting would solve a lot of problems.
Well, you're not alone, Crispin, because there are 2 people that have said yes to the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth.
Can we at least say some? Because I'm sure there are people that just didn't comment necessarily.
I'm joking, there are a few. But they've liked the video, okay? So that's good.
Plenty of people like it.
We're not being super ratioed on it. But I want to shout out to Paul, though, that just says totally agree. And also, see Rutherford, it's like, yeah, this is an interesting idea, and 5 states, Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, almost quite neatly recreated. Perhaps what is even more is Belarus and its historically being more related to Poland and Ukraine than it is to Russia. This old fact may actually come to play and affect Putin's war at some point. So that was just an interesting comment. I don't know. Have you guys changed your mind? I have no idea.
Yeah, we'll see. One of the big challenges, actually, and the funny you mentioned Belarus, eventually Lukashenko will go. He's old. And there'll be some kind of transition change in Belarus. There is a question of how to integrate Belarus into the rest of Europe, because there is a significant portion of the population that sees themselves as kind of closer to Russia, culturally and politically. And there's a significant portion of the population that sees itself as being closer to the West. It is kind of torn between those 2 worlds in a sense. If there was a political entity that everyone in Belarus could historically identify with, which would be the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, as I said, the people that are living there today had always been loyal to the Commonwealth, regardless of the religious differences, then it might help unify a post-Lukashenko Belarus and be like, yeah, we actually do have a political identity within this Commonwealth, which we had historically enjoyed our privileged position. And that might help that. And also with the rest of Europe as well, because there is a significant portion of the Belarusian population that is skeptical of the EU, is skeptical of these Western ideas, who look at what's coming out of America right now and social issues and stuff, and they have real concern. The Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth could kind of help moderate that. So, yeah, who knows? I'm a big defender of it, so I'm not taking a step back on this. I realize that people are like, no, but I don't think... Like what they are saying no to isn't the vision that I'm putting forward.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I want to circle back to Germany and the current war in Ukraine. So there's news broke out that Germany is refusing to give its Leopard 2 tanks.
That's right.
To Ukraine, and also any tanks within Europe, the German tanks, they also don't want to contribute. Why is that? Why suddenly Germany decides to backflip, given that it made promises to rise its GDP military spend to 2% and has failed again to do so?
Yes. Germany is just an ever spiraling embarrassment when it comes to this subject. On the one hand, I can understand, in general, having strict restrictions about allowing your military technology to end up in the hands of third countries when you sell property. So certainly the United States has this rule that if you buy military equipment from the United States, you can't give it to anybody else, on-sell it or anything like that without their prior permission. And that's for obvious reasons. You don't want non-state actors, violent groups, people that would use that weapons for crime, from getting their hands on military grade gear. And so having that provision is fine. And to have a blanket statement say, under no circumstances can this ever happen, is in general okay. So that's as nice to Germany as I can be here, is that it's not out of step with the way other countries handle much of their military sales. That said, it's only Germany in this case that seems to be the roadblock, right? Other countries are allowing people to provide military equipment to Ukraine, should they so choose, and other countries that have got Leopard tanks want to provide it to Ukraine. We should also talk about what tanks do. The reason why the countries involved have been reluctant to provide Ukraine with tanks is it's hard to argue that it's a defensive weapon. In fact, they're terrible defensive weapons. A tank, we saw this in the Second World War when Germany started running out of fuel. They couldn't drive their panzers everywhere. They had to use them in sort of defensive pockets. And they were disastrous. They were sitting ducks. And so what they are is heavy assault vehicles for going on the attack as combined arms forces with infantry and planes and other things to smash through enemy lines, right? That's what a tank does. And so if you provide tanks, what you are conveying to the Russians and the international community at large is that you want Ukraine to go on the offensive and take territory from the Russians. And that's why
their own territory. They want it back.
I'm trying to be generous, okay? I'm putting forward the strongest argument one can make for Germany's reluctance to try and be fair. And yet, you're completely correct. I mean, the fact is, it's not like Ukraine is going to be driving those tanks to Moscow, okay? They'll be driving them into Crimea and to retake territory that has been taken by the Russians in Donbass in the east of the country to liberate their own people and liberate their own territory. The Russians are obviously histrionic about this. They kind of think that if the rest of the world is providing tanks, then they're providing offensive weapons to Ukraine, something that the West, I guess, previously would have communicated they weren't going to do. They weren't going to provide weapon systems that allowed Ukraine to be quote-unquote aggressive. And the reason why people are pushing for tanks to be introduced is, A, the Ukrainians have been asking for them, but also because Ukraine has proven its ability to win. This is what has really changed things, is that the collapse of Russia's Kharkiv front in the east, the withdrawal from Kherson, has shown that Ukraine is not only able to hold its own, but it can beat Russia in the field. And if it's provided with the weapon systems necessary to do that, then they may well succeed. I think one of the fears that other allies have is that Russia is just going to keep throwing more and more at this to the point where something happens that makes it escalate into uncontrolled. That if Ukraine is really going to take Crimea, which of all the territories that is Ukrainian is the part that Russia sees the most as being now part of Russia, and that Russia is likely to invest the most in defending, that if it really came to a battle for Crimea, the Russians would use weapon systems and technologies that it hitherto has not used, and that the destruction as a consequence of that would be immense, and the risk of escalation would be immense. And so there is a fear in Germany in particular that if Ukraine is too successful, the war will escalate. Where they are completely wrong, one of the many ways they're wrong, is that it's the fear of escalation that emboldens Russia. Right? If Russia believes that the rest of the world is only going to go so far to help Ukraine win the war, then they have very little incentive to stop fighting.
Of course.
Right? They just keep going to war until the West loses its stomach for support, until the next big thing comes along that distracts, such as Taiwan. And then Russia concludes a treaty with Ukraine on its own terms on the basis that the rest of the world isn't going to help Ukraine actually win. It's only when Russia has a real danger of being pushed out of the, potentially losing territories that it hitherto never dreamt would ever lose, that it has to start making concessions and has to start coming to the negotiating table in a way that treats the Ukrainian concerns seriously. And I think the White House, to the credit of President Biden, and of course I'm one of his big critics, but one of the credit of President Biden is that he has started to come to the realization that the war's only going to end with Ukraine actually taking back all of its territory.
Of
And
course.
therefore, the more that can be provided to the Ukrainians to do that, then that should happen. The big fear that has stopped them is that this idea that if Ukraine was threatening Crimea, Russia would resort to using tactical nuclear weapons to prevent that from happening.
Will it happen?
No, I don't think so. I think, well, the fear in Washington has receded. It remains a risk, but I think the Russians realize that the consequences of that decision, in terms of just international prior status for as long as anyone will ever remember, is going to massively outweigh any potential symbolic gain that act. First of all, the act itself smacks of desperation. If you have to resort to tactical nuclear weapons, then you're not a spectacular great power, are you? You're acting like North Korea would act. Okay, so you're not a mighty empire if that's the case. You're basically exposing your own weakness. Secondly, the rest of the world, having broken that taboo for the sake of a bit of territory on a peninsula or in the Black Sea, would mean that no country would be doing business with Russia. Like this idea that countries would still be buying Russian oil and stuff. Even the Chinese would stop buying Russian oil at that point. So I don't think it's likely. Certainly, if Russia's own territory was threatened, if they were marching on Sochi or something, and they use tactical nuclear weapons on their own territory to stop advancing armies and so forth, the reaction would be a bit different. There's no risk of that. The international community has never recognized Crimea as part of Russia, and therefore, if Russia was to use nuclear weapons to hold Crimea, then it would rightly be perceived by the international community as a nuclear use in order to hold stolen territory. And for all of these reasons, I don't think it's particularly likely, simply because I have to believe Russia's not that stupid. But even if they did, it wouldn't be the end of the world, because the United States wouldn't, say, for example, retaliate with nuclear weapons. This wouldn't end up in a nuclear conflagration. There is no extended nuclear deterrence for Ukraine. There's no... just the Budapest Memorandum notwithstanding, which is another issue, there is no treaty obligation for the West to use nuclear weapons to defend Ukraine. And thus, that won't happen. It would be a single-use unilateral act by Russia, which would universally be seen as a criminal act. And if it's this kind of weird logic that the Germans are using to justify not providing tanks to Ukraine, that something might happen multiple steps in the future as a consequence of Ukraine being successful, what you're actually saying is we don't want Ukraine to win the war. That's what Germany is saying. Oh
yeah, of course. Don't they have still accepting energy from Russia? They've still made arrangements with Russia. They don't want them to win at all.
Yeah, Germany is a perennial embarrassment for that reason. Now,
and they're getting all the benefits from being part of NATO. I don't understand. I don't get it. If you're not going to lift your weight, get out. Just get out.
That's a great question. If not for defending Europe, why is this happening? I mean, the United States has 30,000 troops in Germany, legacy from the Cold War. So Germany benefits immensely from protection of foreign powers.
It's rich too.
Yeah, it does indeed that protection. Poland now has the largest military in the continent of Europe.
True.
Not because Poland is richer than Germany. Poland has a third of the population and about a fifth of the economy, even less. And yet, it's obviously pulling its weight in a way that Germany simply isn't. So it's a total embarrassment. Now, Germany, I don't know if there's been any updates, but last I heard, Germany will potentially allow the export of their tanks to Ukraine if the United States provides Abrams tanks.
Oh, yeah.
That's really a big question mark because, first of all, American tanks require a lot of training. They're much bigger. It's not straightforward just to provide the tanks and allow the Ukrainians to go ahead and drive them. It requires work. I mean, even the Patriot missile system that is going into Ukraine, and it requires 6 months of intensive training of dozens of people to operate. Not saying the Abrams tanks requires that, but if you have a significant number of these tanks necessary to make a strategic difference on the ground, it will require, a sizable portion of Ukraine's military to operate the tanks, and not only operate the tanks, train everybody else in how to work alongside tanks as they're advancing. And Leopard tanks are not as complicated, not as large, close, more similar to what Ukraine is already used to using. I do think that one of the positives is that one of the purchasing of German equipment is going to be significantly curtailed. I don't think many customers are going to go to German suppliers for their military equipment, knowing the restrictions that Germany is placing on, even in times of desperate need, providing that military equipment to others. But we'll see. I mean, I don't think Germany can come out of this looking particularly good at this point on. I think we should continue to praise Germany when they do the right thing.
Of course.
But that praise is few and far between because the deadbeat of Europe right now.
It makes me really upset to get the US involved. Bring US tanks to Ukraine, given that the US has already flooded Ukraine with lots of money already.
That is the one thing I can say for Germany is that it's consistent with their foreign policy. So the German strategic policy is don't do anything without the Americans. Okay. So they're always the last horse to cross the finish line. They'll wait for the Americans to act, and then they will use the political cover that the Americans have done to follow suit. The thing is, though, America has already provided, as you say, huge amounts of support to Ukraine. So that issue is kind of by the by. Like tanks, yes, they are offensive capabilities, but they're not unique in the way that they don't change dramatically anything qualitative in terms of the nature of Ukraine's military fighting power. Like Ukraine is still going to go on the offensive, regardless of whether they get tanks or not.
Yeah,
it's just a matter of how successful they'll be.
Mm.
There was one thing from Vaitutis who sent me a suggestion, which I haven't mentioned to Charlene. I said I would, so this will be her reaction live. This year, Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, turns 700.
Oh my God.
So we should do a history of Vilnius, either as a multiple part or a one part, I don't know yet. But what do you think? We should do to celebrate the 700th anniversary of one of the finest cities in Europe.
700 years. Oh my God. What is this? Old? Oh yeah, for sure. That's amazing.
Yeah. So I can't wait for it. Ever since sort of Gediminas' dream on the top of the hill, I think it would be a great story. And the different trials that the city has been through all of that time. And yeah, great for anyone who hopefully goes there and can maybe make a connection with all the things that you see as you walk around that wonderful place.
Yeah.
So looking forward to that. Also, the suicide issue, which we'll talk about gravely. Our friends have provided us, and we'll give a shout out in the actual video, all the resources we need to be able to do that, and also perhaps TFs and interviews. Now that Charlene is here, we can produce that.
History of Lithuania is going to come out soon. I finally have time to finish
part
scripting
4
and editing. Yep.
Which is going to be great. That covers the time where Lithuania was under the occupation of the Russian Empire.
And the era of the book carriers and retaining their language.
It's a great point. Like, how did Lithuania maintain its cultural linguistic identity during such a time of oppression? And it's also kind of a silent history. Not that many people know too much about it. So I'm looking forward to that. What else have we got in the pipeline?
I'm trying to think. More shorts. I want to bring Lithuania to the world, so there's going to be a lot more shorts about the Baltic.
Oh, go grab your book.
What book? Essay book.
Yes, this is a fantastic text. Very, very dense. This is the
Of Gods and Men by Geramis.
Grimas, fascinating character actually, the author. But it's all about the Lithuanian mythology and Baltic traditions and myths and legends. And we also, when we were in Šiauliai, went to this amazing place that was just dedicated to the sort of pagan mythology. We took photos and imprints of every one of the gods and creatures, kind of descriptions.
I felt so bad because I thought it was only like a park of this tiny. I was like, oh yeah, we'll get to all of them. And then it just scaled, like you had to go up hills and across the river and statues everywhere.
Yeah, so look, hopefully we'll be able to produce tons of videos now that Charlene is literally going to be doing this full time, and we now have everything set up. And thank you everyone for your patience to this point.
Agreed.
Because yeah, it's all been hurry up and wait and lots of promising. So, but now
it's happening. Yes. I don't know. Has anyone read this book?
Well, there were people on the channel who suggested it to us. Assume they have.
You can't read it like a bedtime story. You need to concentrate in this book because it's about linguistics more than the stories.
That's right. Actually, and this is one of the gaps that I've noticed in the tradition of the Baltic is that you don't have the book of fairy tales in the way that you would have in other traditions, and the most comprehensive text on this, as Charlene says, is a work of investigative linguistics, to be like, okay, this particular myth comes from this region because of these linguistic tropes used to describe them.
Yeah.
And so it's good for providing evidence when we say, this Caucasus is from Lithuania.
Yeah.
Then that's good. It's really good for that. But in terms of telling a story about a Caucasus,
I need the explain like I'm 5 version of this book, and maybe that's a challenge for us to do as we kind of translate this book and work through it and share it with the world. Well, so that's all the time we have for today. Any questions, comments, please leave them down below. Otherwise, stay safe and
ciao for now.